going to go ahead and get started.
I've already got the recording on, E. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a DHA candidate defense on December 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at Franklin University. This defense is a virtual defense. Our candidate today is Ms. Alicia Williams, and she will defend her dissertation titled as Crisis Communication and the Emotional Response of Stakeholders and Exploratory Qualitative Study. I am the moderator for today's defense, and my name is Yi Yang. I'm the program chair for the Doctor of Professional Studies in Instructional Design Leadership. So thank you everyone for being here today, attending Alicia's defense. And let me go over with you our agenda real quick. I will introduce our candidate, Ms. Alicia Williams. And then after the introduction, Ms. Alicia Williams will start her oral defense. And she has up to 1 hour for her defense. And then there will be 20 minutes Q&A from Alicia Williams committee members. After that, the floor will be open to the general audience, which you will have 10 minutes to ask questions for the candidate. After the Q&A from the general audience, Ms. Alicia Williams committee members and I will be taken into a separate breakout room. At that time, feel free to stretch and get your drink. That will be about 15 to 20 minutes. After that, we will all come back to this same Zoom room, and I will announce the outcome of Alicia's defense. So with that being said, I'm kindly asking you to turn off your cameras while Ms. Williams is making her presentation. And thank you very much. And the floor is yours, Alicia.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Yang. And I do just want to take the time to thank you all for joining me for my defense this afternoon, titled Crisis Communication and the Emotional Response of Stakeholders, an Exploratory Qualitative Study. And before I get started, I do really just want to take the time to acknowledge and express my gratitude to my dissertation committee members. I have Dr. David Meckstroth. He served as my advisor over the last couple of years and soon after became the chairman of my committee, Dr. Karen Lankish, and then I also have Dr. Jessie Florang as one of my committee members. And to be completely honest, I can't really find the words to tell you all how thankful I am to have had committee members that were so dedicated to my success. There were so many times that I had become overwhelmed just with the entire process in general, and having you all to remind me that things will be okay, it's a part of the process, and we will, soon make it through this process, made it that much better. And so I just wanted to take the time to acknowledge you all and tell you thank you. An introduction to the field of crisis communication. So crisis communication is a relatively new area of study, with much of this research being completed within the last 30 years. Now, in the 90s, this is when the field of crisis communication really began to develop, and much of the research began to surround the creation of crisis response strategies. Now, this was due to an influx in high-level crises that had occurred in the previous decade. And so in the 80s, there were a few pivotal crises that had taken place that really jump-started this field of study. Now, some of those crises include the 1982 Tylenol crisis, the 1986 Challenger shuttle crash, as well as the 1989 Exxon oil spill. And so as a result of these crises that had occurred, there was definitely a shift. And for the first time ever, stakeholders really began to question organizations. They began to question what the organization's stance was on this particular event that had occurred. And they wanted to know what knowledge the organization, had pertaining to the crisis and what they were doing to share this information with publics. And thus, the field of crisis communication really began to pick up, and then it has, developed into what it is today. And so crisis communication is an essential tool that is utilized by crisis managers. It allows them to share pertinent information with diverse publics. It allows them to protect the organization's reputation and image, and it allows for the effective management of crises. During this time, the expectations of stakeholders are disrupted, and this in turn results in an emotional response. The research design that was utilized for this study today is an exploratory qualitative research design, as qualitative research is intended to generate knowledge grounded in human experience. Now, qualitative research is also good when there is a topic that there may be limited information on, and as a result, further investigation needs to take place. As I began this research study, I did not have any preconceived notions in regards to the research methodology that I would utilize. But as I delve into my research, I really took the time to sit and I just began to ask myself, what research methodology would allow me the opportunity to best address my research questions and to gather all of the needed information. And as a result of that, I did decide that an exploratory qualitative research design would be best suited to address my research questions. Now, this particular methodology allowed me the opportunity to sit down with participants of the study, and it allowed me to uncover an in-depth account of their crisis experiences, as well as the emotions they experienced. And had I utilized another research methodology, I do not feel that I would have been able to uncover such rich data. And so the purpose of today's study is to gain a better understanding of the emotions that are experienced by stakeholders as a result of crises that they experience. This study examined the stakeholders' crisis experiences and perceptions, as well as the emotions associated with those experiences. Now, the importance of emotional acknowledgements into crisis messaging. Crises are emotional events for organizations as well as the public, and only recently has emotion been incorporated into the study of crisis communication. In order for organizations to effectively communicate with its stakeholders, it is imperative that organizations not only understand the emotions that their stakeholders experience, but also have knowledge of the various coping strategies that their stakeholders utilize. The integration of emotional acknowledgements into crisis messaging could prove to be very beneficial for organizations, as it will allow them the opportunity to craft messages that expresses understanding, and it also lets stakeholders know that the organization understands and acknowledges the crisis emotions that they are experiencing. This study is significant in that it makes both practical as well as academic contributions to the field of crisis communication. This study will make practical contributions to the field of crisis communication, in that the results of this study could prove to be beneficial to organizations who have undergone crises and are looking to improve strategies in the future. This study also makes academic contributions to the field, in that it extends the way that crises are examined, and it continues to move the field of crisis communication forward in the examination of crisis emotions. So in an attempt to uncover and better understand the various emotions that are experienced by stakeholders as a result of crises and crisis communications received, the researcher has posed the following research question. What are the key emotions experienced by stakeholders during crisis situations? And furthermore, how did the stakeholders respond to these emotions during crisis situations? Now, there are some key terms that will emerge throughout the research study that the audience should be aware of. The first key term is a crisis, and this is defined as an event that is an unpredictable major threat that can have a negative effect on an organization, industry, or its stakeholders if it is handled improperly. A crisis is unpredictable, but it is not unexpected. Publics is referring to the group of people that influence the business activities of a company or people who have real or potential interest in the company. Publics are responsible for building your company's image amongst the customers or the industry. It is also important to note that the term publics in crisis communication is oftentimes used interchangeably with the word stakeholders. The last key term is uncertainty, and it refers to the inability to determine the present or the future. There are some assumptions, limitations, as well as delimitations associated with this study. Now, assumptions of the study, the researcher assumed that participants received communications regarding their crisis experience from either the department, institute, or enterprise level at the organization in which they worked. Now, this assumption was made based on the notion that communication is foundational in the mitigation of crises, as well as keeping key publics informed. Some limitations associated with the study. Due to the sampling method that was utilized as a part of the study, participants may not be representative of the population. And as a part of this study, participants were asked to draw upon crisis experiences that were felt to have greatly impacted their professional life. And so as a result of that, participants did draw upon many crisis experiences. And so different crises may elicit different emotional responses, and this will in turn impact the participants' experiences. And lastly, the delimitations associated with the study is the fact that all participants in the study work in a neurological institute at a large healthcare organization in Northeast Ohio. And that brings us to our literature review. So as a part of this study, the participants' crisis experience, as well as their emotions, were definitely the focal point. But it is also important to note that the researcher did inquire about the crisis communications that each of the participants received from the healthcare organization in which they worked. And because of that, it is important to note what crisis communication is and when crisis communications may be utilized. And so crisis communication is defined as the collection, processing, and dissemination of information that is required to address a crisis situation. Crisis communication is also utilized in pre- and post-crisis efforts. Now, as I previously mentioned, crisis communication is foundational for organizations to disseminate information to its stakeholders, ensuring that they keep them informed on the crisis situation at hand. Defining the crisis and crisis types. So I have shared with the audience what a crisis is, as well as crisis communication, but it is also important for the audience to be aware of the characteristics of a crisis. Now, as mentioned by Almer and colleagues, crises are unique moments in histories of an organization, and there are 3 key characteristics that set crises apart from unpleasant events. Now, these three characteristics include a short response time, the element of surprise, as well as posing a threat to the organization. Now, the element of surprise comes about when an event comes at a time or at a level of intensity that exceeds all of our expectations. The short response time is oftentimes due to the uncertain and threatening nature of crises. And as a result, organizations or practitioners do have to respond promptly. The element of threat comes about when an event threatens either the organization's stakeholders or the organization's financial stability. Crises can also be characterized as being intentional or unintentional. Intentional crises are those that are created to cause harm to either an individual or an organization. And some examples of this crisis type includes unethical leadership, as well as poor risk management. Now, unintentional crises are those that are outside of the control of the organization. And this particular crisis type may include things such as a disease outbreak or downturns in the economy. And so it is important to note that crises are unexpected events, and due to the unexpected nature of crises, they cannot be managed with routine procedures. Prior research on the field of crisis communication emotions. So crisis communication has really become a robust area of study. It does have rich literature in regards to the creation of crisis response strategies. And so we are beginning to see a shift in the type of research taking place. And more investigators are beginning to look into the stakeholders' crisis emotions, as well as the integration of emotional acknowledgements into crisis messaging. Now, just to share with you all a few of the early but pivotal studies in the area of crisis communication starts with Coons's 1999 study, where he examined the effect of information-based responses versus those that express compassion towards publics. Now, the purpose of this study was to create response strategies that would effectively address accidental crises, as at this time, accidental crises were quite high. In this study, an experimental design was utilized, and a total of 144 crisis managers were included in the sample. They were selected as a part of a convenience sample as they were at a crisis management conference. Now, during this time, participants could be assigned to one of four conditions, either the high or low informational-based condition, or the high or low compassion-based condition. These participants were asked to review the messages that they were given and in turn rate the messages that they were given. And so the results of this particular study showed strong support for crisis responses that included compassion towards publics. Now, Moon and Reed did take a different approach to their research as they focused on forgiveness as an outcome variable. Now, this study set them apart from previous studies as organizations' reputation and image was often utilized as an outcome variable. So for this particular study, an experimental design was also utilized, and there were a total of 200 undergraduate students that were participants for this study. These participants could be assigned to either the informational-based condition or the emotional-based condition. They were then instructed to review the messages that they had received, and they were asked to rate their likeliness to forgive the organization based on the information received utilizing a forgiveness scale. Now, results of this study showed that the integration of emotional appeals in crisis messaging was beneficial. And researchers further noted that to better understand crisis communication, it could be meaningful to examine the stakeholders' emotional and behavioral responses. The last of the early but pivotal studies includes Jen and colleagues' series of studies where they created the integrated crisis mapping model. Now, this model was created as researchers aimed to better understand the various emotions of stakeholders during crises. Now, looking at this model, the organization's level of responsibility is attributed to the crisis that is being experienced. Now, this will then in turn elicit a primary and secondary emotion from stakeholders. Looking at the x-axis, we can see our public's coping strategy. Cognitive coping is considered to be action-based coping. And in this scenario, this is where stakeholders really try to spring into action and find a solution to the crisis that is occurring. Now, cognitive coping is a little bit different in that stakeholders who engage in cognitive coping really just try to change the way in which they view the crises. Looking at our y-axis, we have the organization's level of engagement ranging from high to low. Organizations who have high levels of engagement are said to have allocated many of their resources in the mitigation of crises. And alternatively, if an organization has low engagement, they essentially are not allocating enough of their resources to the mitigation of crises. Now, the creation of the integrated crisis mapping model really was a pivotal moment in crisis communication research, as this model helps us to better understand crises, and it somewhat serves as a framework for organizations or practitioners looking to craft messages with more of a emotional acknowledgement. So the previous studies were very significant in that they note the value of integrating emotional acknowledgements in crisis messaging. They acknowledge that emotional acknowledgements add value to crisis response. They positively change the stakeholders' perception and behavior and restore organizational reputation. Now, similar to that of previous studies, this study is also significant as it will continue research on stakeholder emotions. The conceptual framework that was utilized for this study is the attribution theory. Now, this theory posits that individuals are continuously interpreting events in an attempt to make sense of the world around them. As individuals are trying to assign the causes of events that go on in their everyday lives, these events can be attributed to either an internal or external factor. If causes of events are assigned to an internal factor, it could be due to the individual's inability or ability. If it is assigned to an external factor, the cause of event is assigned to some external situation or event that is outside of the individual's control. Now, as noted by Bernard Weiner in his attribution theory research, he noted that unexpected events were more likely to lead to questions of why than those that were expected. This theory has since been integrated into the field of crisis communication, and in particular in crisis communication theories. And Coombs has noted that two key traits of crises is the fact that they are unexpected and they are negative. And these are also two key aspects of the attribution theory. As a result of that, this study applied this theory as individuals are constantly trying to understand the situation that is going on and make sense of it. That now brings us to the methodology. And so an exploratory qualitative design was utilized for this research. This enabled the researcher to gather rich qualitative data, and it allowed for open-ended dialogue through the use of the Zoom platform. Convenient sampling was utilized as the researcher had access to this study population. The use of flyer advertisements to recruit employees was utilized, and this was due to the fact that there were special provisions put in place by the organization. And lastly, semi-structured interviews were conducted via the Zoom platform. Population and sample. So for the study, both clinical and non-clinical employees were invited to participate. Clinical employees are those who diagnose, treat, and create treatment plans for patients, and non-clinical staff are those who work in an administrative capacity, usually on the back end. And what they do is they ensure that the organization's operations go smoothly. Both clinical and non-clinical employees were employees in the Neurological Institute at a large healthcare organization in Northeast Ohio. Now, there were a total of 14 participants that were included in the study sample. 8 of those participants were clinical, and 7 of those participants worked in a non-clinical capacity. 14 of the participants were female, and 1 was male. Now, in the table on the right-hand side, I have listed the participants' years of work experience in increments of 5 years. And so participants with 0 to 5 years of work experience included 3, 5 to 10 years of work experience included 5, 10 to 15 years of work experience, we had 3 participants, and those who had 15 plus years of work experience included 4 participants. Data collection. So as I previously mentioned, flyer advertisements were utilized to recruit employees for this study. Now, these flyer advertisements were placed throughout the Neurological Institute in areas that are heavily populated by employees, such as break rooms, provider workrooms, and they were also posted on the community bulletin boards. Now, the researcher was sure to avoid any clinical areas, as these areas are often heavily populated with our patients. And so the researcher wanted to be sure that the appropriate participants were being recruited for this study. Now, flyer advertisements were used as the recruitment method, as the organization did have additional provisions in place for the recruitment of employees as research subjects. Now, if looking to recruit employees within this organization, they do not allow the direct solicitation of employees, and therefore the flyer advertisements were the approved method for recruitment. Now, included on this flyer advertisement was a brief overview of the research. It listed the participants that may be appropriate to sign up for this study. And then it did tell participants how they could contact the researcher. The flyer advertisement advised these participants to reach out via email or telephone. And at the time that the participant reached the researcher and expressed their interest in the study, they had the opportunity to ask additional questions. The researcher was able to further explain the purpose of the research. They reviewed informed consent information, and after that, they scheduled a date and time for the interview. There was an interview protocol that was utilized as a part of this study. Now, this protocol really served as a guide for the researcher, as it ensured consistency and accuracy in the questions that the researcher asked to each of the participants. This interview protocol also included things such as key terms and definitions, examples of crises, and this information was shared with each of the participants at the start of the study. There was a total of 9 interview questions that were also included on the interview protocol. And these questions surrounded the crisis experiences as well as emotions, coping strategies, crisis communications received, and recommendations for organizations who may be experiencing crises. Data analysis. Now, prior to the formal data analysis session, the researcher was sure to listen to each of the audio recordings from the interviews. This was then checked against the interview transcription. This process was completed several times as the researcher just wanted to ensure accuracy in the interview transcription, as this document would be utilized for the data analysis process. Now, data analysis and coding was completed through the Atlas TI software. This was done by uploading each of the interview transcriptions to the software, and it in turn allowed the researcher to review, code, and categorize the themes. Code identification. So as a result of the research data that had been collected, the codes were developed, and in turn, 6 key themes were identified as a result of this research. Validity and reliability of this research study were enhanced by taking part in the following. A standardized research interview protocol was utilized. Each of the interviews were recorded and transcribed. Now, this was done via the Zoom platform, and this proved to be very beneficial for the researcher as it avoided the use of multiple tools for recording and transcribing of interviews, and it ensured that this took place in a secure environment. The Atlas TI software was utilized to assist in interpreting and transcribing interviews. Member checking was also utilized at the end of this study by providing each of the participants with a synopsis of key themes. Now, this was provided to participants via email, and in turn, they could respond to the researcher with any questions they may have and express any concerns in regards to the findings. And lastly, the researcher took 4 to 5 days between data analysis sessions. And we have now arrived at the results for this study. So prior to reporting out on the results, I just want to give you all a brief overview. So interviews for this study took place between June 12th of 2021 and September 30th, utilizing the Zoom platform, and interviews lasted anywhere from 35 to 45 minutes. A total of 15 healthcare professionals were interviewed, with 8 of those participants being clinical and 7 being non-clinical. The Atlas TI software was utilized for data analysis, and an inductive coding was utilized as it did allow the themes to emerge as a result of the research. A total of 19 themes were initially uncovered from this research, but those were then further condensed down into 6 key themes. And this was done as there was overlap across the themes. So our first key theme for this research is confusion and anxiety. Now, this theme came about as participants gave a detailed account of their crisis experiences as well as the emotions they experienced. Now, during this time, 10 participants spoke of large-scale crises that they experienced, and the remaining 5 spoke of more micro-level crises that they experienced throughout their career. Now, it is important to note that during this time, of the 15 participants, there is 1 participant who stated that they were unable to recall the exact emotions that they had experienced during this time. The participant did speak to what they thought they may have felt at that time, but they did make it a point to note that they were unable to recall the exact emotions. Now, when asking participants about the crisis they had experienced, as well as their emotions, they often attributed the feelings of confusion and anxiety to the uncertainty that surrounds crises. Now, participants spoke about how on a daily basis, they were continuously trying to figure out their current state, and they oftentimes worried about what the future would bring. The second theme of this research is finding distractions. And this came about as participants spoke about the actions that they took to cope with crisis emotions. Now, this was an extension of the prior conversation where participants spoke about their detailed accounts of crisis experiences and emotions. And they then led into talking about the difficulty in disconnecting at the end of each workday. And so in talking about this, the participants then noted that they did whatever they could to find distractions. Now, some of these distractions included mindfulness practices, prayer, and exercise. The third theme of this research is emotional exhaustion. And this was a result of participants detailing the impact that crises had on their personal and professional lives. Now, for this particular theme, participants noted emotional exhaustion, allowed them to, it allowed them to, well, they had the inability, I apologize, to disconnect at the end of each workday. They oftentimes experienced difficulty in sleeping at night and even interacting or connecting with their loved ones when making it home at the end of each workday. Now, when asking participants what really led to their feelings of emotional exhaustion, they often attributed this to the constant changes that occurred throughout crises. Now, each of the participants did acknowledge that crises are ever changing, and they understood that as a result of that, not only does information change, but works processes also changes. But they did note that it did not make it any easier to deal with the constant changes that occurred. The fourth theme of the research is transparency and honesty. And this theme came about when asking participants a series of questions surrounding the crisis communications that they received from the healthcare organization in which they worked. Now, all of the participants did note that the communication that they received during this time was very effective. And what made this communication effective is the fact that it was transparent and honest. The fifth theme of the research is flexibility and staying in the moment. And this theme came about as participants began to reflect on their crisis experiences and in turn talk about the valuable lessons that they learned as a result of crises. Now, all of the participants did note different lessons learned as a result of crises. But one thing that all of the participants' responses had in common was the fact that they all acknowledged the fact that they need to remain flexible, they needed to stay in the moment, and have the ability to adapt as crisis situations occurred. Now, the last theme that is associated with this research is transparency and listening. And this theme came about as participants were asked to provide recommendations to organizations who may be undergoing crises. Now, all of the participants did note the importance of transparency in communicating with employees, but there were a couple of participants who noted the importance of listening to your employees. Now, one participant in particular did make a very interesting point in regards to transparency and listening. And this particular participant noted that there is power in transparency, and sometimes that means that the organization will have to admit that they are unsure at this point in time. After admitting that, the organization can then let its employees know that although they are unsure, as they uncover additional information, they will be sure to share that with the team. She also noted the importance of listening to your employees, as employees like to feel like they are a part of a team. They like to know that not only are their suggestions being listened to, but also their complaints. And that brings us to the discussion for this study. And so there are a few recommendations that were made for leaders and practitioners as a result of the research data that was collected. So the first recommendation includes ensuring that communication is transparent and honest. Now, this recommendation was made based on the communication that participants received from their healthcare organization. Now, as I previously mentioned, all of the participants noted that the communication they received during the crisis was in fact effective. And the components that made that communication so effective was the fact that it was transparent and honest. The second recommendation includes providing resources and services that aid stakeholders in coping with emotions. Now, this recommendation was made based on themes 2 and 3, as participants oftentimes found difficulty in disconnecting at the end of each workday, and they experienced emotional exhaustion. Now, one participant did note that the organization did in fact provide these resources to the employees, but this participant noted the difficulty in gaining access to these resources. And in turn, they suggested that the organization make such resources readily and easily available for participants. The third recommendation includes strategizing the release of pandemic and crisis-related information, and maybe categorizing this information in regards to high, moderate, and low levels of importance. Now, this recommendation was made based on the fact that many of the participants did note that although communications were effective from their organization, it was oftentimes difficult to digest such large amounts of information. Now, if information is categorized according to low, high, and moderate levels, it will allow the organization to streamline the way in which they communicate with their employees. It does cut down on the influx of information that employees are receiving on a daily basis. And it does allow employees to categorize the information according to its importance, and in turn act according to what is most important. And lastly, the last recommendation is outlining responsibilities for stakeholders to carry out during crises. Now, this recommendation was made with the non-clinical stakeholders in mind. Now, many of these participants did note that during the crisis situation, they really did want to contribute and find a way to help out, but they oftentimes noted that they didn't necessarily know how. And so outlining responsibilities for not only these stakeholders, but also those who work in a clinical capacity would ensure that everyone is aware of the role they would play when such crises occur. And then lastly, we have recommendations for future research. I did make 4 recommendations, and this includes the continuation of utilizing a qualitative inquiry to investigate crisis emotions. Now, this will prove to be beneficial as it will provide an in-depth understanding of the individual's lived experiences. The second recommendation includes further investigation into crisis emotions in a current or ongoing crisis. Now, in this study, 14 of the 15 participants were able to recall the emotions that they felt in the moments of crises. And there was only one participant who was unable to recall their emotional state. But further investigation during ongoing crises would provide a more accurate depiction of the participants' emotional state. The third recommendation includes expanding the pool of participants included in the study and potentially the research location. Now, as I mentioned, this current study was limited to the Neurological Institute, and it could be beneficial to expand across departments. And lastly, to utilize the methodology of this study to further investigate crises. Now, that would allow us to better understand how such crises affect society, really looking beyond the physical, really looking how it impacts society mentally as well as emotionally. And that does bring me to the end of my presentation today. The next couple of slides will include the sources that I cited throughout this presentation. And so I do just want to take the time to thank you all for joining me this afternoon, and I can answer any questions that you might have at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. The next, I'm going to invite the candidates dissertation committee chair, Dr. Dave Maxstroth, as well as her committee members, Dr. Jessie Floreng and Dr. Karen Lankish, to ask the candidate questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. Thank you very much, Alicia, for a very well done presentation. I certainly enjoyed that. I do have some questions, but I'm going to defer to the committee members first. And hopefully they won't ask all my questions, but no, if they do, that's fine. But Dr. Lankish, would you like to go first, and then Dr. Floreng, and then I'll come last?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Maxstroth. And Alicia, that's a wonderful presentation, and thank you very much for providing us with the overview of your research. So I do have a couple of questions, and something that maybe something you would recommend researching, further research is, I was just curious if you found any, like you broke down the different years of experience of your participants. Did you see anything or notice anything about the way they handled their emotions based on their experience? Like someone that had maybe fewer years experience exhibited certain emotions, whereas someone that maybe had more experience, they reacted differently with their emotions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that question. So I did notice a difference in the one participant in particular who was unable to really recall the emotions that they had experienced. And they talked about a crisis that they had experienced very early in their career. And as a result of that, that really kind of set the tone for how they maneuvered throughout situations that they would, experience, to come. In regards to the other 14 participants, I did not really notice a difference, as many of these participants did talk about the current pandemic that we have going on. I think if our current state was different, they may have answered those questions a little bit differently. But being that the current pandemic is something that was completely unexpected, it really impacted everyone. So does that answer your question, Dr. Lankish?
It does. It does. I just thought that might be interesting look for the future too, as well. Continue your research. Yes, so I have a couple other questions. One of my other questions is, what was the most challenging aspect of completing your study?
Yes, ma'am. So as I conducted interviews, it was honestly really difficult to remain objective. As I was sitting on Zoom calls with participants, I had to make sure that I didn't ask questions that led them in one way as opposed to another. I also tried to watch my body language and even my facial expressions, as you can see everything on my face. And so it was really at times difficult to remain objective. I can recall participants asking me, you'd ask them a question and they'd say, well, can you further explain, or can you give me an example? And you really had to make sure that you avoided leading them in one way or asking a question such as, well, did it make you feel nervous? Because, as a result of that, you'd oftentimes get a response that says, you know what, yeah, I did, and this and that. And so it was just really maintaining that objectivity.
All right, great. That's all the questions that I have. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Floring.
Thank you.
I'll start with just echoing. I thought you had a wonderful presentation, nicely organized, well delivered. Thank you for that. My first question is, could you expand or maybe clarify or explain a little bit on your 6 key themes? You stated that the transparency and listening, I believe that was the 6th key theme. And you
Yes.
talked about organizations admitting when they were unsure or admitting when they didn't know something. I was just wondering what your thoughts were related to your first key theme about confusion and anxiety that dealt with the uncertainty. And if those two could possibly impact each other. If an organization admits that they're uncertain, would that fuel your theme 1 of confusion and anxiety among stakeholders?
Yes, sir. So looking at that, I think that during times of crisis, if an organization were to openly admit that they were unsure of the current state, I do believe that initially it would really stir some emotions of confusion or anxiety. But I do believe that as stakeholders kind of really took a step back, they may begin to think about, the fact that the organization was transparent and, they were able to admit that they don't know everything. And as things continue to uncover, they are willing to share additional information with stakeholders. So I do believe it would have some initial impacts, but I think in the long run, it would prove to be beneficial.
Thank you. My next question or thought is probably a little bit more broad, and I apologize, it may come out as a ramble here, but I assure you there's going to be a question in here somewhere. So if you need me to repeat it or clarify it, please let me know. But I do think it was a very timely study, and I'm glad you said something about the current pandemic, because based on your definitions, it sounds like for sure, at least initially, the pandemic fit the definition of a crisis in the healthcare setting. Now, what I'm wondering about is your key themes wrapped around, talked a lot about uncertainty, trust, transparency, honesty, all of those things. And one thing, at least on the social level, the pandemic has done is I can't say that it's caused, but it's probably amplified or vocalized some distrust and division in the medical or healthcare community. Do you think that the timing of your study highlighted what was going on based on the pandemic, or do you think your findings would have been very similar, let's say 3 years ago, prior to the pandemic?
Thank you for that question. So that is a very good question. Thank you for that, Dr. Floring. I do believe that some of the responses may have been the same had this study been conducted 3 years ago versus being conducted today. But I definitely think that the current state fueled a lot of the responses that participants gave. In particular, the point of being transparent and honest. I definitely think that was one thing that was fueled by the current pandemic, as participants often felt that they didn't know what to believe. There was so much information coming from so many different directions. And so, you know, with the organization being honest and transparent, I think that was definitely fueled by the current pandemic.
And thank you. And I'll just close. I don't have any other questions, but I'll, I guess, echo what has been said prior to. I think your findings and your results are very important and can potentially be used in future research or even built upon to help understand specifically the pandemic. So I think you've provided some foundation that could possibly you or someone else who's interested in it could possibly use this in the future to look back on the pandemic. Because as we know, we won't know the full effect for several years as to how this has impacted people and crisis communication. So thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Floring, and thank you, Dr. Lankish, for your questions. Few questions and then maybe a couple comments, Alicia. On your participants, they all were obviously impacted by crises, the emotional exhaustion, et cetera. Did they discuss about the length of time it took them to get back to equilibrium so
Yes.
that they felt like normal again?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. And I'm glad that you did ask that question because I did ask participants, could they recall how long they experienced those crisis emotions? Very interesting. One participant, you know, said that she was confused and anxious, but as she stopped and thought about it, you know, she felt safe and secure as she knew that the organization would deal with the crisis at hand. Other participants noted that they felt these emotions for months at a time, just because it was a constant roller coaster with the current pandemic. And so with participants, the amount of time that they experienced the emotions really did vary per participant, some for a couple of days and some upward of a couple of months.
Very good. That's what I would have anticipated because it's very individualized, I think, in terms of how long it's going to take you to absorb and kind of feel normal. And then my other question pertains to one of your recommendations. I think all your recommendations are important. I think the one that really kind of stands out in my mind pertains to the release of information, and to do that, try to categorize it in high, you know, importance, moderate importance, and low importance. Can you give me a sense of the did the participants discuss that at all in terms of you know, the communication? Did they get too much information too fast? Was it prioritized? I know that there's an adage, you can't over communicate, but I personally would disagree with that, because you have to, at least my personal opinion is, you have to synthesize, you have to know your audience. If you communicate too much too fast, it's not going to be heard, and so on and so forth. So anyhow, what kind of feelings did you get from your participants on that aspect?
Yes, sir. So participants did speak about receiving large volumes of information during the crisis. And what they stated specifically was the inability to prioritize action items, because every email was sent as high priority. How do you sift through all of the emails and figure out what is or isn't priority? And so I made the recommendation to categorize information according to high, moderate, and low levels of importance. So my thought process was any information that the leadership team would categorize as having a low level of importance is information that you would like to share with your team, maybe even as just an FYI. This information could be shared with the team maybe every couple of days via an email or even on a weekly basis in a department huddle or department meeting where the leadership team really just wanted to make, the team aware. Information that would be categorized as having a moderate level of importance is information that is important and it does require action, from the department or the organization as a whole. But these are action items that can be completed maybe over the course of a few days or within, a week's time. And so as a result, the leadership team could strategize how they wanted to share this information with the team, and then plan for the release of this information in anywhere from 24 to maybe 72 hours. So that's for the moderate level of importance. And then any information that had a high level of importance needed to be released immediately. This is the information that you send out with a high priority email. And in turn, the department's leadership can follow up with, a Teams meeting where they further elaborate on that email and they allow the employees to ask any questions. So I think if information were categorized in that way, it would allow the participants or employees of an organization to, first focus on that information that is considered high importance, act on that, and then kind of move down the chain of command.
Very good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And before I turn it over to Dr. Yang, I just want to acknowledge and thank Dr. Lankish and Dr. Florian for all their great contributions. As always, you're both great to work with, and certainly were instrumental in assisting Alicia to get here today. And thank you, Dr. Yang, for moderating Alicia's dissertation defense. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Yang. The committee is concluded with its questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dave and Dr. Lankish and Dr. Florian for your questions, answers, and the answers from the candidate. Now, now I'm opening the floor to the general audience. If you have any questions for the candidate, you can type in the chat box, and either me or our facilitator, Ms. Kelly Gaza, will give you rights to speak. Any questions from the audience for the candidate? You may also raise your hand, use a reaction button, raise your hand. I think Dr. Gail Franco have a raise her hand. So go ahead.
Yes, I just want to say great presentation, Alicia. I'm tagging off of one of the others. I think Dr. Lankish asked the question of, or I don't remember who asked it, but about how the group, depending on their years of experience, reacted to what was going on. Did you see anything in the age group range? Was there a difference in the generations as to how they coped with stress? Sometimes you see that depending on what their coping skills or how they were raised depends on, some buck up and just go move on, and others, really don't have the same coping skills. So I wondered if you noticed anything in the age range.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that question. So in thinking about the results of the study, I didn't see much of a difference in the participants' coping strategies, as many of the participants reported on very similar coping strategies, especially those who spoke about the current pandemic. Many participants spoke about mindfulness practices, prayer, meditation. And so I didn't see much of a difference in this particular study, no, ma'am.
Great, thanks. I just wondered, I know that generations deal with things differently, and maybe they just had really good support of from family or someone that gave them, that helped them with their coping skills. So that's good to hear. In some respects, that's good to hear.
Thank you, Dr. Franco, for your questions. I think there's another question raised in the chat box from Ferry. Ferry, would you like to speak, or you want me to read your question?
I can speak. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Alicia. Very
Hi.
excellent presentation and very important to the field of healthcare. I just have a question on why did you choose this topic? Was there a particular reason you chose this particular topic?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Green. So I actually have a master's degree in health and risk communication. And as a part of my studies in my master's program, I did focus on crisis communication and crisis response. And so as I entered into my doctoral journey, I began to think about what particular topic I had interest in. And so, as a result of that, I decided to kind of stick with something I knew as I was very interested in it. And honestly, it just proved to be beneficial, given our current state. So it was a topic that I entered into the program, with in mind.
Okay, thank you for your response.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green, for your question. Any other questions or comments for the candidate? We'll count 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right. So the Q&A are closed right now. So Dr. Dave, Dr. Florian, and Dr. Lankish, I will join you guys in a separate breakout room. So Alicia, feel free to, and the audience, feel free to take a break, and we'll be back within 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We're back pretty quickly. So I am going to announce the decision from the candidates committee that Ms. Alicia Williams will be approved and pass your oral defense. The next, I'm going to invite the candidates committee chair, Dr. Dave McStroff, to speak more about the committee's decision. And then after that, and after that, Dr. Florian and Dr. Lankish, feel free to chime in with your comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yang. Well, congratulations, Dr. Williams. We're very happy for you. And I would prefer to go last here. And I'll defer to Dr. Florian first for his comments, and then Dr. Lankish, and I'll go last. So Dr. Florian.
Congratulations. Excellent job. And I'm still kind of processing some of the things, and more so for me, the implications and the applications of what you've done, which I think is excellent, and how this applies not only to healthcare, But as we know, many different professional domains are interconnected, and even to education, to research, to healthcare settings. And I'm still wrapping my brain around it. Kind of how I summarized it was, it was a very difficult time with the pandemic. And I know you had a lot of extra hoops to jump through. What that did though, is I think you had some very powerful findings that, although are somewhat surface level, are very important, because somebody has to do those so somebody else can build on it. And I think you've provided that, which is going to create an opportunity for people in different fields to expand on this. And I think the opportunities of expanding on what you've created here are, we don't even know how big or how powerful your results can be. So I think that's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So congratulations, Dr. Williams. I know this has been a long journey for you, but I think that you have handled it very well, and I'm really pleased to see that you did so well today, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lankish and Dr. Floring. And again, Dr. Williams, congratulations. Very happy for you. And as Dr. Floring talked about, I think your study is very important. Every day there's a new crisis, right? All you have to do is turn on the news, and it's not if there's a crisis, it's where is the current crisis and what's happened. And so I'm very happy for you. I looked up, I keep a log, of all individuals, and I looked up, we first spoke in October of 2017. So that's been over 4 years where we spoke, I think every month almost, over a 4+ year period, right?
Yes.
And you won't have to worry about that anymore. But that was really good. I also wanted to just mention for the audience, Alicia had a rough go of it, getting through the IRB. Dr. Marnie Schaefer with Franklin's always terrific. She's great to work with. Unfortunately, she had to go through her own organization, and that took well over 6 months for her to. She had to basically start from scratch, but I know I was getting frustrated, but Alicia, she handled it like a pro, and I was very impressed with how you handled every hoop that you had to jump through with your current organization. But you made it, and I'm very happy for you. And congratulations again, Alicia, Dr. Williams. And I'll turn it back to Dr. Yang.
Thank you, Dr. Dave. Thank you, Dr. Florian and Dr. Lankish for your comments. And congratulations, Ms. Williams, Dr. Williams, for successfully passing your oral defense today. And the committee also recommends that there will be no change for your dissertation. So please continue to work with your committee for the final logistics for submitting your dissertation to the university, as well as all the other work required for your graduation. At this time, I would like to invite your program chair, Dr. Gail Frankel, to say a few words.
All I can say is congratulations, Dr. Williams. I'm very proud of you. I've watched you come through the program. I think I started as an adjunct about the time you started as a student. So we've been around for a while, but I look forward to seeing what you do with us in the future. I think, like Dr. Floring said, this is just the groundwork for many great things to come and for a lot of other people to be able to build on the foundation that you have provided. So congratulations. I can't wait to see you at graduation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Franco. And the next, I would like to invite our Dean of Doctoral Studies, Dr. Wendell Seaborn, to make a few remarks.
See, congratulations, Dr. Williams. I had a few thoughts I was going to share with the group, but they've all been shared. You did an excellent presentation. Your study was so well timed. I'll date myself a little bit here. You mentioned all those pivotal events that started crisis communications way back when. I remember when those things happened. So it's not that long ago. I want everybody to understand that. But you know, as your committee has said, you've done excellent work. As Dr. Maxtroth said, he talked about you're doing the IRB and having to do it at the location as well that you were using. I really appreciated the fact that you said you were interviewing both clinical and non-clinical employees of the institution, because what Dave didn't specifically say was you had to go through the clinical training for their IRB. Although you were not doing clinical research, you were only doing survey, interview research, but you had to do that, and you did go through that. You were a trooper. You have kept your positive attitudes. You've journeyed on, and you've made that. So I'm very proud of the effort that you put forth, Alicia, that you've gotten through this, and you'll be a model for some of our students to follow on. If things don't go exactly the way you think they are, through no fault of your own, through institutional issues or whatever it is, that you still stick with it and you stick through the plan and you work the plan and you finish your program. I always tell our graduates that our names are now forever linked, and we're proud of the fact that they are. And we hope that if you need any assistance from the university for further research, publication, whatever it might be, that you let us know how we can help you, and we'll be glad to do that. But for today, rest, relax, revel in the fact that you have now completed. And just with that, let me tell you once again, congratulations, Dr. Williams.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Seaborn. Lastly, I would like to invite the candidate, Dr. Alicia Williams, to make some remarks.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr.
Anything you want to say? Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am. Once again, I really just want to tell my committee thank you. As noted, I had quite the long IRB approval process at my organization. And so many days I became frustrated and overwhelmed, and they just reminded me, Alicia, it's going to be okay. We'll make it through this process. And we have finally made it through this process. So I just want to thank you guys so much for all of your support during this time. I do also want to acknowledge Dr. Shin Yu. She served as my mentor at my place of work in order for me to move forward with conducting my research. She's an individual who is very, very busy, very involved, but she still signed on to help me. And so I appreciate that more than she'll ever know. So thank you to my committee. And then thank you to Franklin University. I've had, a very pleasant experience over the last 4 years going to school here. So just thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I appreciate everyone coming to Dr. Alicia Williams' oral defense. And now it concludes her dissertation defense today. And thank you very much for your time, and hope you all have a great day, and hope you all have a wonderful holiday season.